Well, welcome back to the Culture Coach podcast. I am so excited for my guest today, Morag. Welcome to the show.
Wendy, I'm so excited for our conversation today.
Me too. Well, let's just dive right in. I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey and what you're doing today.
Oh, well, my journey has been winding. I mean, if you go back to when I was in elementary school or middle school, I had no idea where it was going to end up. I thought I was going to be a long distance truck driver because I thought I could see the world, but ended up enjoying the sciences. So I was going to be an engineer and I loved applied mathematics, physics. And then at high school, you had to do an arty type program, so economics. And in that was a chapter on how banks create money. And I put aside the being an engineer and thought, this is fascinating, the circular movement of money, etc. So I went into finance for 15 years. It's nothing like that chapter in economics, by the way, but it exposed me to industry and it exposed me to lending millions of pounds to different companies around the world. Well, at that time, they were all based in the UK or Europe. And that is how I got to what I do now, because very often people would come and see me as the bank manager, the pillar of the community with their cash flow forecast, their business plan, with a fabulous idea, a product or a widget that was going to make them wealthy. And when I looked at what made the successful businesses from those who were average or unsuccessful, it wasn't just that they had an amazing product or service. They also paid attention to how business got done, which is the people side that you and I are focused on. So it was who we are as individuals, that inclusivity and diversity, but also the how we relate, how we make decisions, how we handle conflict. And so that's what pivoted me into a passion for building successful organizations, teams, and leaders, essentially one conversation and one relationship at a time. And so I left banking, joined an American telecom company, which opened up the world, brought me to Colorado, where I have been based for the last 20 years. And when I'm not working with leaders from around the world, I am the mother to 3 sons who are all 6 foot tall now. So you can work out their age. And I'm a ballroom dancer and a classical musician. There you go. So a little bit of everything for you to pick on there.
I love it. So diverse. That's awesome. And we connected on the fact that I also have a son in Colorado. He's 6'4". So,
oh, wow.
Yeah. But I love that your journey wasn't, you made this people connection, not from the place of HR, but really truly learning about business and came to the conclusion on your own, just the importance of people and the connection, that really makes the business run. And so I think, and you have a couple books really, so you've got Cultivate the Power of Winning Relationships and The Future-Proof Workplace. Well, I'm sorry.
There's 3 books. Yeah. I know, it's like 3 elements of surprise. So yeah, The Future-Proof Workplace is the kind of red-headed stepchild, fabulous book, definitely ahead of its time and still relevant. But the 2 that go hand in hand, you've already mentioned Cultivate the Power of Winning Relationships. The 2nd edition of that one is coming out shortly. And then the sister book to that is You, Me, We, Why We All Need a Friend at Work and How to Show Up as one, which is where my co-authors and I reframe the Gallup 10 question from their engagement surveys, the do I have a best friend at work? We've reframed it, and more on that later.
Yeah, wonderful. One of the things that's changed over time, as you know, is the pandemic that's really made what we thought, I think when Gallup came up with those questions, we were mostly in, 4 walls with those people. So how has the work that you're doing changed over the last 5 years since the pandemic?
Oh my goodness. Well, it's both shifted and become even more important. We're seeing the cracks and fissures in all of the research that show that we are becoming more disconnected in a world where technology gives us the illusion of connection. And we only have to look out at the headlines in the newspapers around the world, but also from our own research and the research from Deloitte, from McKinsey, from Harvard, etc., showing that the isolation, loneliness, that disconnect, not just from the work that we're doing, but from our colleagues, is becoming endemic. And that's what our research, our books, and our work with our clients actually looks to solve. Because what we know is that if you want to be successful in business, it is all about relationships. And if you want to be successful in life, of which work and business is part, you need connection, which means moving from beyond just transactional relationships where you do your stuff and I do mine and we'll be okay. Well, with the pace of change in the world, okay is not enough. We need to get to that transformational level where we've got higher trust, higher engagement. We get to the tough conversations sooner. And you only do that when you have a culture where I feel like you care, where I am being set up for success, and where I feel like my voice matters, that it is being heard. And so for us, that is what we are often working to do with our clients who are often in IT, technology, engineering type roles. So highly sophisticated, highly complex environments for whom the people piece, the politics, silos and turf wars, that friction is what's slowing down their ability to deliver business results together.
Yeah. I've had experience in a tech company for 10 years. I worked in a tech organization, and it was actually one of the organizations that had the best culture that I've ever experienced. So they had cracked the code and figured it out. But I'm curious, and I've been away from there for 7 years now, but I'm curious, when you're working with organizations and for the leaders that might be listening, what are some of the things that you would recommend they can do to start building this kind of sense of belonging in the workplace?
Well, I think your earlier question also touched on the challenges right now, is that when we move to a more hybrid or more commonly hybrid working experience, it did cause an erosion in that sense of culture and belonging. Because when we did congregate in person, it was easier for me and my spidey sense to sense, oh, Wendy, you're a bit quiet. What's happening for you? It also, on the other end of the scale, created opportunities for those water cooler conversations, the chance encounters, or even sitting in an open plan office, to hear the conversation, even subliminally, that's happening a chair or two down the row. But that allows us to connect the dots, both in what we're doing together, but also in that relationship, so that when I know that I need to ask you for something, you're more than just an email address or a name in a corporate directory. And the pandemic, and I'll admit, when the pandemic hit, prior to the pandemic, my approach to Zoom and all of these tools was, it's second-class citizen. If you want to be a better human, you have to do it in a room with other humans. Well, that opportunity was taken away from all of us. And our forward-thinking clients, as soon as the pandemic hit, we had several CEOs call us up and say, the work that you are doing is too important. In fact, we want to double down on these during the next few weeks, the next couple of months. Because at that time, we all thought it was going to short. Yes, we didn't know. And I think that has exacerbated the issues that we're seeing today, because we tried to force fit or didn't give deliberate thought to how do we need to adjust how we show up in a now two-dimensional celebrity squares at best, rogues gallery at worst environment, where all of those things I've just mentioned, those chance encounters, have gone away. And so we worked very thoughtfully with our clients to help translate the in-person leadership programs and management training into something that was highly interactive, highly experiential, but designed for Zoom, but we also worked on how do you cultivate relationships through the camera. And I've learned personally, I mean, you think about our connection already. We got onto the Zoom, we found points of connection. We went from strangers with nothing in common to now acquaintances with somewhere in common and someone in common in terms of our sons. And it's only getting deeper because we've made that choice. And so as I think about it, some of my deepest, newest friends I have made as a result of those pandemic conversations because I chose to reveal more of me and to make that mental shift that it can be done, and to slow down enough to create the space for the small talk and the conversations that would happen naturally in the office to happen here. And I'll give you one more example, because I'm curious about the company that you cited earlier that you said had a great culture, what they did. But one other example that I've seen in every Zoom world, Teams, Google Hangout environment is that when we get onto the virtual meeting 2 seconds late, the first thing we say is, I'm so sorry I'm late. And then we get straight down to business. Now, when we worked in 3 dimensions, you could roll into a meeting 2 minutes, 5 minutes late. Nobody would bat an eyelid because you'd say, oh, I just the restroom. Because heaven forbid we had restroom breaks. Or, sorry, I'm a couple of minutes late. Maybe I acknowledge it. I just bumped into Wendy and we just had to catch up. And everybody's like, fine. And then there'll be a little bit more banter of, oh, yeah, Wendy's great. And then we get down to business. So if there's one thing that leaders can do to start creating that sense of belonging is to slow down, is to create the space, to start your meetings like we do at SkyeTeam with something, we call it Ripples and Joys. And it's the what have we done to move a project forward? How have we impacted a client? But also, what have we done that's personal or professional that's brought us joy? Personally, this week, my thing is I'm temporarily in New Orleans and I'm experiencing my first Mardi Gras. And it is amazingly out of my British comfort zone, but it's fantastic. And so that's where we start to build those connections thoughtfully and deliberately through the camera. But what about you, Wendy? What about your work and that company you mentioned earlier? What did they do that made them stand out for you?
I'll say, though, too, that I have been guilty of, and when I was in the corporate workplace, I know that feeling of just wanting to get it done, right? Like jump on the call or, like, here's the fine points. Now let's get on to the next meeting or the next, you know. And it really took me a while as I grew in my leadership ability to understand the importance of taking the time to just connect personally. And I do believe, as you've said, now being on a screen, it's even more important because we're not there to read the body language of those sitting next to us or catch up as you're walking out of the meeting or walking into the room, So it is so important to really start the meetings that way. I love that you're doing that. The company that I worked for when I was in the tech world, and I was with them when they were private, and then they went public, and then they went private again. So I experienced this all of these great transformations. I was part of the team when we did some acquisitions that I got to go to India and Hong Kong to look at their culture. How are the team we were acquiring? What were the things we were going to give and take? What did we want them to take of our culture and what were we going to take of theirs? But I would say one of the greatest things that they did really, we had a hybrid work environment before the pandemic. And so working remotely was already something that they were comfortable with. But one of the connector for us all, 2 things I would say. First of all, they used strength finders. And so we all knew our top 5 strengths. It was on our desks. We talked about it in performance reviews. And it was integrated into the way we did things, as were our core values. And they really, truly were integrated. It wasn't, they weren't just on the wall. They were part of how we talked about things, how we related with each other, how we knew if we were making the right decision or not. And so I think having a common language which for us was strengths and core values. We had a way to, translate our way, who we were, how we were showing up in a way that others could understand.
Yeah, I love that, because that common language and framework, as I said, that gives us something to hang our hat on. And too often value statements can be fancy posters on the wall, but you don't necessarily see words and actions align. And as I think about it, we are now, I think, on cohort 5 or 7. One or the two. I don't know why it's the odd number, but anyway, it's a client that's been with us for a while, and the CEO attended the very first cohort of their leadership academy, and he made the explicit, and this is a defense contractor, so you can imagine, double PhD, rocket scientist, very, very smart, but he made the choice to be in the room for every single cohort afterwards, which is a huge time commitment, and not just sitting at the back, but partaking in the conversation to help get to know his team. And the programs we design now have an element of in-person. So we do bring people together, usually at the beginning and graduation, and then everything else is done virtually so that we can accommodate everyone. And in that very first cohort, he was listening to this whole ripples and joys idea. And he said, so am I hearing that I've got to start all my meetings with 5 minutes of small talk? And Eric, my business partner, was like, why, yes, Mark, yes, you do. And so Mark went away and he literally put Mark's 5 minutes of small talk at the top of his meetings. And everybody laughed because he's only following what Eric told him to do. Well, it took on a life of its own, such that as other cohorts came through and as he talked about this, as leaders attended his meeting and saw him commit to doing it, not just gloss over it, they took that bullet point, Mark's 5 minutes of small talk. I think he called it Mark's 5 minutes of banter, but either way, it ended up on their agendas too. So it became a running in joke, but I'm not joking. It transformed that culture from one where people didn't know each other when they bumped into each other at the coffee station because they were all working behind locked doors on different projects, to ones where they did recognize each other. They still couldn't talk about their work behind the doors, but they started to connect in a different way. And the importance of that is, of course, you and I know when things are going well, it's easy. The real test of whether or not we have that culture of belonging and connection is when I'm sitting here, I've hung up from the call and I'm going, okay, what did Wendy want me to do? Oh gosh, I don't know what to do next. Do I either call you or who else do I call? And unfortunately, from our research and the thousands of leaders who've taken our ally mindset profile, 20% say they have nobody they can turn to in moments of uncertainty, stress, or change. And that is heartbreaking. And then we wonder why engagement numbers aren't moving. Well, we have the answer, you have the answer, and it isn't doing what we've been doing. We've got to change the conversation.
Yeah. And I love the example that you give of the CEO, because what I have also found is if the leader doesn't get it, if they are not engaged, then it's very difficult to make those changes because they're not going to stick. You can teach them how, but if there's not the leader reinforcing, it's oftentimes difficult.
Yes, and that can often become a blocker because, well, they need to go through this. They need to go first. That team was mean to my team last year, so I'm not going to do anything until they change. And so that disempowers us. And that's one of the reasons my co-authors and I, in You, Me, We, reframe that question of, do I have a best friend at work? Because as we know from Gallup, there is a direct correlation between being able to answer yes to all 12 questions, but yes to that one, and having a high performing team, which, as we know, delivers higher productivity and greater efficiency and better results for everyone. But our challenge with that question was it's passive, it's reactive. It allows me to continue that finger pointing and blame of, no, I don't have a best friend at work because you know what? I work in Colorado and Wendy in the HQ is in Texas. They get to hang out at the water cooler and I don't. So instead, we've reframed it to, am I a friend at work? Because now it gives me agency. It gives me the opportunity to think, well, you know what? I've been on these Zoom calls with Wendy. I've seen her face on the celebrity squares for the last 3 months, but I've got no idea what she does. Well, you know what? I'm going to just do you have 8 minutes? Because everybody has 8 minutes. I'd love to know what it is that you do and how our roles intersect. Hey, I've seen you on this call for the last 3 months. Do you have 8 minutes? And so it moves us from reactive to proactive. I'm now reaching out to you. And I'm also thinking, not just am I showing up as a friend, ally, go-to colleague for you. In our book, You, Me, We, we're also advocating that you need to show up as an ally, friend, colleague for myself. So it's within guardrails. So that allows us then to set boundaries for us that we can communicate to you that may get to how and when I do my work, how and when we're going to handle conflict. But we've seen that needle move for companies whose engagement data may have plateaued or got stuck, starting now to get a second boost of life as we start to bring the language and framework of the ally mindset to life.
That's beautiful. I love that. Tell me any results or any changes that you've seen in organizations that you've worked with and they've applied this.
Well, so in our research, and we went back and interviewed thousands of leaders from around the world, and we have now more than 1,000 that have taken the ally mindset profile, and we're seeing key themes. And what we identified was 5 practices that make for what we call an ally relationship, but that best friend at work. And it starts with abundance and generosity. They're all double-barreled. So if I go back to my finance time, you could argue there's 10, but for the sake of being the author, there are 5. But it's abundance and generosity, and they're double-barreled on purpose because they're about what we think and do, because you can't have one without the other. But if you have an abundance mindset, so if you think about Simon Sinek and Dory Clark, who've written about the infinite game, and that scarcity mindset, if we don't have an abundance mindset, if we instead think of success as a scarce resource, then we hoard talent, we hoard information. It's my team versus your team. But if I can look at, we're all playing for the same company logo, then abundance, I need to help you to be successful and therefore help me to be successful. Then I'm going to be more generous with my time, expertise, etc. So if I'm now looking out for your success and mine, the second practice is connection and compassion. So it's getting beyond just the job title to get to know a little bit of your journey and story. As I shared in the green room and I shared in my introduction, I have 15 years of commercial finance. If you only meet me now when I'm delivering a keynote or as an executive coach, you might assume that I'm just an HR professional. And there are so many more facets that I can bring to the dialogue. So connection and compassion is not just career journey, it's what makes you tick. I'm a ballroom dancer, a classical musician, I have 3 sons. You know, you're starting to get to know the human behind the skill set. So when we get that, you start to get to trust, and then courage and vulnerability is the next practice comes to play, because if I know that you know who I am and what's happening in my life, what's happening in my job, I am more likely to take informed risk, which means innovation and creativity starts to happen more quickly. It means that once we have courage and vulnerability, we get to candor and debate, which means we're having the right conversations, the tough conversations sooner before the elephants in the room have multiplied and got in the way of success. And then finally, action and accountability, because let's face it, it is easy to talk a good show. It is easy to create a flip chart of characteristics of a high-performing team. It is less easy to actually follow it through with action and accountability, holding my team accountable, but holding myself accountable for what I said I would do. And so when we have brought that framework to bear, when we work with leaders in our academy to say, okay, well, what does that mean here? Because, okay, the Morag definition is great, but what does that actually mean in this company? When you look at your corporate values, when you look at your corporate goals, which of these 5 come more naturally, which are challenging? What myths and legends hold you back from going all in on these? Like, so-and-so got fired 10 years ago for speaking up. And then when you actually ask about it, it's a myth that's just grown out of hand. And even if it did happen 10 years ago, here we are 10 years later, whole different organization and different team. So we've seen it, like that earlier one I shared before, which was very regimented, command and control, my work, your work, the two will never meet, have become much more braided and much more agile, much more responsive, especially in a very shifting external climate that they are operating in.
I love that framework. And I love that it starts with that abundance mindset. And it really, it took me a while because in the corporate space, it does feel in a competitive environment, it's more of that scarcity. There's not enough for everybody to be successful. So I'm going to protect and preserve what I have. So really shifting the mindset to there is enough for everybody. There's room for everybody to be successful. And so we can lift each other up and help each other, collaborate. It's a great foundation.
It is a great foundation, but it's not Little House on the Prairie and kumbaya and group hugs, because competition still exists. And so as I think about it, though, when you have an ally mindset, and we talk about this in Cultivate, so there are 4 relationship dynamics. The ally has your back no matter what. Supporters, who are more like fair weather friends. So when the going gets tough and you think they're going to help you out, it's crickets. Rivals, which is a little bit more Jekyll and Hyde. So you don't know quite who's going to show up in that next meeting. Are they going to be for you or against you? And it's all dependent on their agenda. And then adversaries, who on their best days are brilliant jerks and on their worst days are jerks. But I've also learned that very few people get up in the morning thinking, I want to be seen as an adversary or a jerk at work. Sometimes it's just differing styles, differing strengths that are being brought to bear, maybe too emphatically for how you and I need to work. And so what we've found is that why we call them practices is, even though I've written the book on it, abundance and generosity, that's my default operating system. I can do that till the cows come home. But candor and debate, I'll angst over the tough conversations. Connection and compassion is Ruby's default operating system. She is a heart-led leader, and I have learned so much from her about how to tap into that and let go of some of the British stiff upper lip rigidity that I've had for the larger proportion of my career. And so going back to what you said, when these frameworks come to life, when you overlay it with strengths, it allows a different way to come at what invariably are those interpersonal friction areas from a slightly different perspective, and also give ourselves the grace and space to be human and occasionally make mistakes and to forget. But every day is a new day and we get to start again.
Yeah, that's so true. And if you don't have a level of trust as a foundation to be able to have that candor and debate, I think it can be difficult, but only, at least in my experience, when you're able to have that honest candor and debate, can you really push through? And the accountability that you mentioned, right? We had this debate, we decided on this, let's hold each other accountable to get those. And it can be tough, let's be clear, because if you're my boss and I come and give you some candor and debate feedback, it could be career limiting for me, but I can guarantee it's career limiting for you if you're not getting that feedback loop from your team or from others. And so it's not as simple as just flick a switch and it starts to happen. As we said earlier, leaders need to role model going first, which again is part of our philosophy in You, Me, We, is don't wait to finger point and blame. They need to go first. What can you do? And it doesn't matter where you are in the organization, even if your CEO doesn't believe in this, for example, and maybe your company culture isn't where you would want it to be, but you feel that you don't have that influence. Well, you know what you do have influence over? You have influence over how your team shows up. Create that little oasis of ally relationships
and start to deliver results, because then your teams who rely on you up and downstream are going to say, I want a bit of that action. Mm-hmm. And if you're not a team leader, maybe you can influence as a team member. But even if you feel like you can't do that, you do have the opportunity to think clearly about, how do I want to show up in my one-to-one conversations with my peers and with my colleagues? And where do I need to lean in and turn the dial up on those 5 practices? And where might I need to lean back and turn the dial down? Mm-hmm. For example, candor and debate. I can chat, I can brainstorm, and I can dive deep into business problems because I've got that 15 years of finance and a 30-year career. I've seen a lot so that other leaders don't need to. But I've also learned in my executive coaching that sometimes silence, letting others kind of wallow in their discomfort, can help them and us learn so much more than simply speaking the truth as I see it. So all of these are not absolutes, they are frameworks, but they help us to be intentional about how we show up. And at the end of the day, think about, how do I feel? Did I have a good day? Was that a fun day? Or am I BMWing, bitching, moaning and whining about, you won't believe what happened? And not only how am I feeling about how did that go, but how am I leaving others feeling? So am I bringing the energy that's filling others up and inspiring them to deliver results together when I enter the room? Or am I doing that when I leave and people go, oh, thank God she's gone? And if we're not paying attention, if we're too busy running on our hamster wheel, we are invariably going to make the wrong choice.
So many great points. I mean, from the leadership level to the individual level, so applicable. Yes. Tell us where we can find you. How can people connect with you if they want to work with you, learn more?
Oh, please do. That would be so much fun. Let's do some work together. So firstly, I would like to invite all of your listeners, all of the watchers of this conversation, if you would like to participate in our research, but also get your own free ally mindset profile, you can do that at SkyeTeam. That's SKYE, SkyeTeam.cloud/you, me, we. Okay. You can get both books, Cultivate the Power of Winning Relationships and You, Me, We, Why We All Need a Friend at Work and How to Show Up as One, from your favorite book retailer. And if you message me, I have secret codes for audio and ebooks. So there's an incentive, but you have to say that you heard it here. All right. In the conversation I'm having with Wendy. And then in terms of staying in touch, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I respond to all the messages. And you can also follow our work at SkyeTeam.com, SKYE team.com.
Fantastic. And I will put all of that in the show notes so people can just go and click the link. Morag, this has been such a great conversation. I appreciate all the learnings that you've shared with my audience. Any last minute?
Wendy, I appreciate you. The work that you are doing is making the world a better place. But for those of you who are listening and watching, as I said earlier, success in business is all about relationships, but success in life is all about connection. And you build that one relationship and one conversation at a time.
Perfect. Morag, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it.